So we want to kind of minimize some fears and demystify this idea of budgets because they can be really scary, especially if you're not a financial person. I am not a numbers person. Budgets can feel very intimidating. We also want to help you think about how you tell a story with your budget because storytelling in a grant is incredibly important. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you can design a budget that you can actually live with. Because here's the thing when you write a grant. You create a budget, and guess what? If that grant is funded, you're stuck with living with it.
Right.
And we don't always think about that.
Balancing it, and it'll be different than what you propose.
Yeah.
How to manage that process as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure you and I have both been in a position where we've had to justify, like, oops, this wasn't quite the budget we thought it was going to be.
Or if someone else created the budget and you're stuck with it.
Yes, also a challenge. So, all right. So we want to get to know you a little bit, and those of you who are online, find your little thumbs up or thumbs down in your tools and your options, because we want you to participate as well, and I can see you.
Yeah.
So how many of you have written a grant? Raise your hand. Online, give me a thumbs up. Yay, a couple. Few of you online? Yes, perfect. All right. Have you had a grant application funded?
Okay.
Ooh. All right. Yes, we've got some ones online that have. Go ahead.
Has your nonprofit been around for more than 2 years? Okay.
Why do you think we asked that question? Partly. Also to know the history, like the history of your organization matters when it comes to grant writing. Young, new nonprofits often ask, how can I write a grant if I don't have any history to show? Well, history is also what is the skill set and the history and the experience of the employees. It's important. Mm-hmm. So that's a piece of that history.
Also, some funders specialize in new organizations and some want to see a track record before you can even approach.
Right. And the Nonprofit Technical Assistance Fund, if you are not familiar with them, get to know them. I believe the requirement is you have to have been around for at least 2 years before you can apply for a grant. But they're just only for organizations serving Kent County. But nptafund.org, highly recommend that you find them, talk to Nicole, learn about them, because they're a great help. So, all right. Does your organization do fundraising outside of grant writing? Looking online. Raise your, yeah, got a few. Okay.
Because there's different sources of income, and funders want to see that blended income. Mm-hmm. And it's important to show that to balance out the expenses.
From a funder's perspective, what they're looking at is risk mitigation. So when you're writing a grant, you have to show we're a good risk, because that's always what they're assessing.
And they want to see, does anyone else care about what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how many of you have ever spoken with a foundation program officer? Couple. What about our online folks? A few of you have. Perfect. All right.
And then, are you excited to be here? Woo!
Oh, come on, online people.
Yay,
Only one of you.
up,
two of you are
everyone.
excited to be here. Okay, we got 3.
Okay.
All right. All right. So we're going to get started with some context setting. So as we already mentioned, when you write a grant, you can't think of grant writing separate from the rest of your revenue sources. You can't look at grant writing as something over here, and then the rest of the organization is over here. And I think that is a common challenge that many organizations wrestle with.
Or you can't do the grant writing and then do the budget. It's all at the same time, and if you have someone that handles the finances, you have to be working really close together.
And if you're a larger nonprofit where you have program staff, financial staff, and development staff, all kind of in different spaces, because I spent 6.5 years-ish at the Salvation Army. I know someone online works at the Army. And that was very common. And how to talk across departments was always a little bit challenging. So we wanted to give you some context for this thing that we call grant writing.
Casey has that problem. It's nice.
Hope. Yeah.
At Hope Network, you might say, oh, I wish I worked at a giant organization, but then everyone's more separated and they're more specialized. The finance people might be focused on finances and not nonprofit finances.
Right.
So you're learning together.
Yeah. And you have to talk to each other. So it is so important. Never, ever, ever, if you are the grant writer at your organization, if you're the one responsible, don't ever do it in isolation. It's a team sport. All of fund development is a team sport. So we have to have everybody on the team.
And internally and externally, you're talking to the funders and the community and your colleagues at work all at the same time.
Yeah. So how many of you are familiar with Giving USA? Online folks? Yeah, I see some heads bobbing. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. Saturday morning, I'm tired. All right. So Giving USA is a report that is put out every year. It has, over 40 years, I think this has been going on. Our colleagues at University of Indiana do a lot of the work on this, Lilly School of Philanthropy. There's Giving USA Foundation. There's a lot of partners involved in this. So the thing we have to keep in mind about Giving USA is we're always looking at numbers that are a year old. Why? Because it takes time to collect and comb through and make sense out of the data. So this is the 23 report, which means it's 22 data, okay? So what do you notice? And those of you online, feel free to jump in. We've got a lovely pie chart there. What do you notice?
You're in a grant writing class, so you're looking at you're looking for grants, but what should you be looking for?
There's a large number of individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. The biggest piece of this pie is individuals. Now, interesting, if you go back and look at the last decade of Giving USA, you will see a lot of shifts in the number of individuals. We have a shrinking donor pool in this country, but the people who are giving are tending to give larger dollars, although that shifted last year. So my former colleague from the Johnson Center, Michael Moody, who's now at the Lilly School of Philanthropy, just did an article about that shift in large donors are giving a little bit less. So we're seeing some juggling happen in this particular graphic. If you just go Google the last 10 years of the infographic for Giving USA and laid them side to side, you can see the trend of philanthropy. And it's juggling. Because what we're seeing is less people in this bubble and more in this bubble of foundations. Why do you think that is? Any guesses? Related to the economy, certainly. Yes, and they're in Michigan, certainly, yes. And people are choosing to give through foundations, through a tool that we call a DAF, a donor advised fund. We're seeing a huge explosion in the number of donor advised funds across the country. Great research is done that the Johnson Center was involved in. Highly recommend you take a look at some of that if you're not familiar with DAFs. Because people are saying, instead of me giving directly to a nonprofit, I'm going to dump all of my money into this DAF because there's incentive financially for me to do that, especially at certain times with economics, right? And then I'm going to maybe let it sit there for a while. Maybe I just give it all that year, depending on the donor. But more and more foundations across the country, community foundations particularly, are focusing on their DAF funders, their DAF donors. Interesting thing, there are large foundations like the Atlanta Community Foundation or Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, whatever it's called. It's all DAFs. They don't have a corpus of their own. It's all donor advised funds. So they're basically a pass-through. Money comes in and the donor says, we would like that money to go here over time. okay?
One reason that's happening is it's expensive to set up a traditional foundation.
And it's not always beneficial from a tax perspective for the individual to do a foundation. That's part of this shift, though, is we are seeing more family foundations. So we're seeing this shift in the way that people are choosing to give their money. We have to pay attention to that if we're going to raise money. Yeah.
Is this reflective, I don't know if you have this data, or maybe you will talk about this, of Grand Rapids trend as well? Because Grand Rapids, I know, is a very philanthropic city. So I didn't know if it was like in line with this, or if there's more foundations for individuals, if you even know that.
I've never seen the segmentation for the community. It's not how Giving USA does their reports, so it's hard to pull that. I would guess, based on some of the conversations we used to have at the Johnson Center, we're seeing this foundation piece is probably a little skewed in West Michigan compared to the rest of the country. And that's partly because of family foundations and a lot of corporate foundations, because we have so many family-owned corporations here, large corporations. So I would guess, I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess the foundation part is a little skewed compared to the rest of the country.
But there's people behind every one of these
Yeah.
pie pieces that you want to be communicating with. They're not just a piece of paper or a website.
And that's why I asked if you had talked to a program officer, because that's your link to the foundation. I always like to say foundations are people too, right? We look at foundations as a monolith, but relationship building with a program officer is so incredibly important to everything you're doing, even when you're doing your budgets. Because and I've had program officers do this for me, yeah. Got a question? Yeah.
What can you say about impact investments, and where does this fall within categories?
So impact investing right now is not noted separately in Giving USA. It is a growing trend. It is a growing trend with community foundations. Impact investing can look a couple of different ways legally. Sometimes it looks more like a short microloan, where they loan the money out from a foundation and then that money comes back later and then just gets reloaned. I think GRCF does some impact investing, but I don't know how much, Grand Rapids Community Foundation. So more and more community foundations are starting to think about impact investing. There are more impact investing entities popping up around the country. The one that I am most familiar with, only because I've heard her speak a lot, is Deborah Fries has a big one out in Boston. And she was sort of an very early person. I mean, she started doing this 10 years ago when very few people were talking about impact investing. So I don't know, Stephen, if you have other thoughts on that?
No other thoughts. I think it's partly, it's really important to be telling your story as much as you can so that people hear it and make those connections. The larger family foundations have a staff with program officers for you to speak with. Smaller foundations, they're operated by people. It's a family. They use the foundation to keep the family together. They have to meet at least once a year. But telling that story in a lot of different ways all the time and the ways people can invest will help you make these connections regardless of the esoteric financial tools they're using. You give them a chance to help you.
So if you're not catching this, it's all relational, right? Fund development work is always, always relational, whether you're dealing with an individual donor, a foundation, a corporation, whatever the case may be. So I hope that helped answer the question on impact investing. Whoever asked that, sorry I didn't have more information, but all right. So this is just some context, right? You think about giving, bequest. If your organization isn't talking about legacy language and receiving gifts upon someone's death, think about how you can include that language in your work, and there's a lot of people who can help you do that, okay? All right, so another bit of context we wanted to share, and we've kind of talked about this and alluded to this. When you think about the revenue mix at your nonprofit organization, this is really important to consider when you're thinking about grant writing. How does that grant fit in the broader context of revenue? It's not something over here, and I know sometimes professional grant writers embedded in an organization feel like, oh, you're over there. Everybody else is over here, but it's not. We have to really think about this stuff in context and think about, we have earned revenue, we have fundraising, we have grants dollars. Anybody think about this earned revenue? What does that imply to you?
I'm thinking like maybe, like for my organization, we have membership fees.
Mm-hmm.
It's more transactional.
Like for the nonprofit that I'm starting for my daughter, we'll be selling like jumpsuits,
Mm-hmm.
like for tracksuits for kids and t-shirts and things like that, so that will be earned revenue.
Yep. Earned revenue can be, we consult and help other organizations learn how to do something. Earned revenue is dues. Earned revenue oftentimes, not always, can come with some sort of a contractual agreement, whether implied or written, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a quid pro quo. Yes, administrative fees, yeah.
For the thrift stores and membership fees for Christie Winslow, and then there was a question from Andrea Ryan if the slides would be available afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. We can share them. Yep. Okay. So when we think about this idea of earned revenue, one thing for you to consider, if you write a government grant, whether that is city, state, or federal, it is considered earned revenue. It's not a philanthropic gift in the traditional sense. Does that mean we don't go out and build relationships? Not necessarily, right? Having contact and relationship can be helpful. That's hard sometimes with state and federal grants. Not impossible with state grants. Federal grants, it's tough to figure out who do I talk to in a department. How many of you have ever done a state or federal grant? A couple. Few of you online? No, okay. They're slightly different animals. Why? Typically you get a government grant because some government entity has put out an RFP, a request for proposals. I have seen RFPs that are as many as 60 pages long from government grants. I have written government grants that are as long as 40 to 80 pages by the time that grant is done, right? No small task. Now, we sometimes get dollar signs in our eyes. I had a young nonprofit professional years ago when I was at the Johnson Center, someone who had been through a lot of my workshops and was involved in some of the programming. And she came to me one day. She was running this nonprofit that she had started. She was still running it while working a day job. So no paid staff, very low capacity. She said, I found this fantastic federal grant, and I think I can apply and get the $3 million. And my question was, what are you going to do when you get it? Well, I don't know. When I get the money, that is not the time to figure out what to do.
So what they're doing is they're purchasing $3 million of activities.
Yes.
And can you take care of that? And can you financially control that funding and report on it and show $3 million worth of impact with your organization? Maybe that's an opportunity to collaborate with a larger organization and a smaller one to sort of ladder yourself up to where you're ready to be the larger organization.
Yeah, collaboration is key.
So also, when you're looking at your organization, some people may be super into grants, or some people may love events. What you want is to set yourself up to sort of distribute your time and energy to all three, because like the economy goes down and the corporations stop giving as much, but the federal government or the state government is dumping money into the sector, or you're doing you're getting a lot of people involved, you want to do some events. But then we've done some events, what do we do with these people? You need someone to talk to them and turn them into donors. Oh, now we've outgrown our rental space, why are we paying rent? We should do a capital campaign. Are you having these people building a relationship, or are they doing program fees, and why should I go from buying t-shirts to giving you $5,000 towards a building? So you want to balance yourself out and keep telling these stories in different ways so you're ready when the environment changes, because the environment's always changing.
And the last thing you want to do is put yourself in a position of relying on a grant for a large percentage of your revenue.
I was a founding board member of the Creative Youth Center, which operated at the corner of Wealthy Street and Diamond for about 10 years, working with the two elementary schools. Kids could walk to the organization. It was based on a model that had a storefront that sold stuff that was program fees and then did workshops in the back. And it was volunteer-led, and then they got a Kellogg grant, and that was the worst thing that ever happened to them, because they got a $350,000 grant, which meant they had to have staff to manage it. And then they were they weren't able to grow because they had to fundraise for the staff and the storefront, which was a requirement. So the whole organization was sort of twisted to manage this grant when we should have been putting the energy into supporting the children. And we entered a cycle that we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Those are things to consider when you think about, am I ready?
Well, this is my slide. So why are there budgets with a proposal? Like you write a narrative, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and I'm going to change the world this way. Why is there a budget? Well, rich people get rich because they like numbers. There is going to be people who take the narrative and they toss it aside, and they're going to go right to the budget, and they can get the story from it, and they want it to make sense, and they want to show potential and growth, lots of support in the community, a variety of income sources, so that you are resilient in case of change, that they understand that this is a proposal, like it's not a guarantee. So what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? It's all in these numbers, and they all need to make sense, just like the narrative.
And I hear often from nonprofit organizations, I just had this conversation, I think Wednesday, with somebody. I hear often, well, we can't afford to fail. And I would say yes, and. In some regards, yes, I do agree with that. If we get a grant and we don't deliver on what we promised in the grant, right? Does that mean we're never going to get another grant? This is where relationship matters. The reality is, we're all going to fail sometimes in this work. We're all going to be in a position where we don't quite hit the target budget. We're all going to be in a position where something doesn't quite work in our program at some point in time. So my theory is fail fast and fail forward. Mm-hmm. And if we have relationship with a program officer, when we get that grant, here's the key: communicate. Because if I'm partway through the grant and I'm going, yeah, we're not going to make it. Don't wait till the grant is spent out and the program is done to go to the funder and say, we didn't make it. Go to the funder and say, here's what we're struggling with. I don't think we're going to be able to hit the target. Have the conversation. Now, some funders will say, how can we help? What can we do? They'll work with you. They want to be a partner. What you have to remember when you're dealing with foundations, especially community foundations, but all foundations, they need you more than you need them.
They're trying to save the world and change the world.
They have legal requirements to give away money.
Mm-hmm. They don't want the money back.
Right? They need you more than you need them. Yes, we talk about the power dynamic, and people with money do hold power in our culture and society. I'm not pretending they don't. But as nonprofit leaders, we cannot walk in a room with that attitude. We've got to walk in a room as partners. Level the playing field in our language, in the way we tell story, in the way we build a relationship. We are partners. And use partner language when you're having the conversations.
You're collaborating. My sister used to sell movie tickets at a cinema in high school, and she told me a story. If the cash register was equal, the number of tickets sold balanced out with the change that was made, when the same person had a balanced till every time, they would get fired because it's impossible to be perfect. That shows that there's doing some money shenanigans. So, yes.
That's crazy.
Just, you're proposing a budget. You may you may have said that you're gonna buy 3 computers and you bought 2. Like, let's just figure out how we're gonna get that impact. And at the end of the day, we're gonna talk about, this is what we proposed for a budget and this is what we spent and what did we learn.
Yeah.
If there's, is there a list of foundations?
Yes, there's the Foundations Center directory online that you can access for free at the Grand Rapids Public Library main branch. Go to, set up a meeting with Steve Asarian. He's the business resource librarian. He can teach you how to use it.
I love that you even know the name, because I would not know who to talk to at the library. That's awesome.
Sort of small business entrepreneurship librarian, and he'll teach you how to do the searches for the foundations. So every foundation has to give money away, and they prove that they give the money away, 5% of their endowment, by doing a tax return, which is called the 990 form. And then the Foundation Center translates all those forms into a searchable directory. And you can search with keywords based on your nonprofit and your location and how much money you need. And it's a pretty simple process.
So the Foundation Center's database is probably the most widely used one. There are a few other ones out there. I don't recall the name of it, but if you are connected to a university, I do know Grand Valley has a different database. I don't remember which one they're using now because they've changed it a few times. So there are databases out there. And again, I really encourage you to learn how to use it well, because it can feel like you're falling down the rabbit hole and, oh my gosh, where do I even start or stop? It can get really overwhelming really fast.
And once you learn, it'll become frustrating because there aren't as many foundations as you think there should be. And there's quite a few that they're operated by families, and they will say they don't accept requests.
It's just people they bump into and meet.
Yes.
I work with a family fund out of Chicago, and that's the way they give. They have a website. They don't take any grant applications. We actually don't have an application process. It's the people that we meet and have conversations with. So there are small foundations out there that operate that way that can give away some good money.
So how do you even begin a relationship when they don't know, you're new, they don't know you, they don't have heard of you? How do you begin that?
Well, people that work at foundations like paper and they like to read. So they're very academic. So I would put them
I
on.
agree that they all are. That's a generalization, I might argue with you.
I would put them like a newsletter, email newsletters if you have access to contact information.
You add them to your list, even though they didn't ask?
I think there's a lot of different
If
ways
there's a connection.
to approach. So one place to start is to Do the research and identify the foundations that you're interested in. Then take that list to your board and your key stakeholders. Take a look at board members of that foundation. Do we have any connectivity? Do we know anyone? Right? Look at your circle. Where are those connections? Leverage your network. Is there anybody that we know that we can get a meeting with and sit down and have a conversation with? If there's not, be bold. Send an email to a program officer. You can go online at larger foundations and identify the program officers, usually, not always, but typically will have different areas that they focus on. Find the one that best matches you. Send an email and say, I would love 15 minutes of your time just to better understand what you're giving and to introduce you to this organization. Here's the reason why. Very succinct, very short. Can we schedule some time? Some people will respond pretty rapidly. Some program officers love those conversations. Other program officers are so incredibly overwhelmed, they don't care. And they're not going to respond. So it's a bit of a crapshoot, but it's worth the attempt. The other thing you can do is think about where are the spaces that these people show up. What are the events that I should show up to connect with
Like
someone and meet
community
someone?
events
Yeah,
that they may be funding or participating and supporting in some way that aligns with your mission.
yeah. Yeah, question.
Question, I wonder if there are events where proposals are presented among various funders, like an open market style, where funders pick and choose.
Not anything open to the public that I've ever seen. There are a lot of those behind closed doors meetings. There were a ton of them during COVID. She's retired now, so I can talk about her. You can tell Diana I talk about her. So, when COVID first hit and all the funders were scrambling and everybody was freaking out and trying to figure out what to do, Diana had, I think it was Diana who actually originally convened, different funders in the community just to get together periodically and say, what are you funding? Now, I heard this after COVID, not in the midst of it, that Diana had pulled that group together and they started talking about what are we doing, how are we going to help the community. Many foundations gave above that 5% that they're legally bound to give during COVID. But they also sat in a room and said, all right, you're tackling this organization, you're tackling that one, you're tackling that one, I'll take this one. Oh, wait, we probably have 3 people that should give to this one because the need is so great, and they had those conversations. Mm-hmm. So yes, does that happen? Yes. In a public forum? Behind closed doors? Yes. Funders talk to each other. Here's the thing. If you write a grant and the grant is turned down, again, not everybody will reach out. Send an email and say, I would love to learn more about why our grant was turned down, because we're learning. We want to learn. Could you spend 10 or 15 minutes with me talking about it? They may tell you it had something to do with the way the grant was written. You learn. They might say it didn't quite fit our funding. And always ask. Again, this is where you've got to be bold and brave. This is not this kind of relationship, it's this kind of relationship. And say to them, do you know other funders in the community that might be a better match? I can't tell you the number of leads I've gotten just by asking that question in my career. People will, if you build relationship, they will do those things. They'll say, oh, you should talk to so-and-so over here. So be bold enough to ask.
Those conversations can be really difficult, like with was that uterine band organization? Amniotic band. So, like I work at the Y. They hired me, they could fire me tomorrow. I'm just a hired gun. But with the amniotic band, you submit this thing that's based on your daughter's experiences, like you've birthed it, this proposal, and someone's turned you down. That can just be just crushing because it's your life. Then you re-traumatize yourself by trying to have a conversation like, why do you hate me? Is the conversation. So, but you have to stay focused on the kids you're helping and the families. It's not a hate. Like when you go to the supermarket, you don't hate that spaghetti sauce because you bought this spaghetti sauce. You just made a choice, and it aligned with what your interests are right now. And you might buy the more expensive spaghetti sauce one day once you learn more about it, and there's a risk. And
not like it.
you might enjoy it or you might not. So this is a conversation, like, especially if you can set yourself up as an expert in this niche area. Like, you're interested in healthcare and families and kids. We are. How can we work together? And maybe you didn't get the $5,000 grant. Maybe there's a $100,000 grant that you wouldn't have access to because you got a gift right away and then they move on.
I appreciate that context. So that's why those relationships are important. And again, not everybody's going to respond, but people will. And it's being respectful. Do not approach someone like an ATM. Approach them
Yeah.
as a partner. We know we have shared values. We know we want community impact. How do we connect and do this together?
You can be a community leader. You can, post things online to share your experiences and what you see in the field. You can speak at city council meetings. Advocate for yourself. Be like a resource. Set yourself apart.
So important.
This is the starvation cycle that
Has anybody heard of this?
There's a sense when you want something to happen and you want to get a gift and you say like, oh, how about, and you get nervous and you want a yes, like, how about you just give me $100? And then the funder sees you as a $100 organization, but you promised to do all this work. And they end up with unrealistic expectations because you're promising a $10,000 organization for $100. And then the overhead is all the things that you have to pay to do the work. Electricity, water, gas for your car. And where did that come out of the $100? But they're running a business because the donors like numbers, and that's how they made their money. Like, let's go. You promised $10,000 of work for $100, and that just cycles, and then it's money coming out of your account. You're putting things on your credit card to make it work because you want to be successful. You can't get into this situation.
There's a great article that came out, oh my gosh, over a decade ago, I think, from Stanford Social Innovation Review. If you don't pay attention to SSIR, they have really fascinating things in there. I highly recommend that you pay attention to it. But if you Google starvation cycles, Stanford Social Innovation Review, the original article will come up. And it's really fascinating the way it talks about that. So how many of you think about, like when you think about asking a foundation for money, does it feel a little bit intimidating and scary? For most of us, yes.
For me, it's very scary.
And he does this professionally. You've been doing it, what, 30 years,
30
right?
years, yeah.
It is. That's a normal emotion. But the thing we have to remember is we have to be really careful about getting into this position, about being afraid to be really honest about our quote-unquote overhead. Let's change the conversation, right? We have to be really careful not to set ourselves up for these unrealistic expectations. I said I could deliver $10,000 worth of work on $100. Why would I say that? Because I'm nervous and I'm afraid to ask for what I really need. Partnership language, right? This idea that we have this pressure to conform to a certain way of doing things. The sector is changing, and frankly, the last few years, it is changing rapidly. Funders are shifting. Funders are stepping more into trust-based philanthropy. People are rethinking having a foundation in perpetuity. There's a growing movement that foundations should have a deadline, an end date. Not community foundations probably ever because of the nature of a community foundation, but other foundations. The sector is changing. Funders are starting to ask different questions. We need to ask different questions, right? So it's important to not fall into that cycle and don't allow a funder to push you into that cycle.
There's been the pressure to operate a nonprofit like a business, which gives the sense of do all this stuff, all this activity for cheap. But when you see big businesses, are they cheap? Or do they spend a shit ton of money to try to make a lot more money? And
Advertising and marketing and just,
yeah, they launch new business.
fail fast, right? They're
Yeah.
failing fast.
They launch a business, it doesn't work, they cut it, they move the staff to something else, they start 10 other things, they see what works, they spin things off. That's operating a business. You're operating a business to grow and change the world.
And I like to say to people, nonprofit organizations are corporations, right? We file as a nonprofit corporation in the state of Michigan. But our bottom line looks different. So we need good business principles, which includes how are we budgeting for these grants? That's good business principles. We need those good business principles. But our bottom line is changing the world. Our bottom line is not about what's the biggest profit I can make for our quote unquote owners, right? Our shareholders. Our shareholders are the community. What's the greatest value we can create for the community? That's our job as nonprofits.
And your biggest asset are your people, paying them fairly. A lot of nonprofits treat their clients better than they treat their staff. And that's
Or their
wrong.
staff end up being their clients because
Yeah,
they can't afford
right.
to pay their bills, right? In social service organizations. It's hard.
It does work both ways.
Talk to me about that.
Sometimes they overpay. I mean, you read headlines about people who work excessively.
You will see sometimes in very large organizations, sometimes in foundations, you get into the multiple six-figure, and there are times, yes, where it can be excessive. There are other times where, especially local nonprofit organizations, I read recently to live in West Michigan comfortably, meaning afford rent, food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the last number that I read is your income needed to be, what, $54,000 a year, I think is the last one that I read recently. How many nonprofit organizations are starting salaries 38, 42? Okay, the government says through their number crunchers, I have to make $54,000 a year to actually live comfortably in West Michigan, and that's called survival. That's not even extras. And my job wants to start me at a salary of $42,000, there's a gap.
And
Right?
then the people that can do those jobs are privileged, most likely. And then you have all this white saviorism in our communities.
Right. So it's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle sometimes. So when we're thinking about our grants and we're thinking about how do we actually prepare to do this work, how do we think about budgeting? We've got to get really honest and be willing to be really transparent, which frankly requires some vulnerability, and it's scary.
What does
So-
it actually cost to do the work that you're doing? Not what, putting everything on your credit cards, but what it would it cost to, the way I think of it is if you're going to be raising money for a program would be, what would it cost for a nonprofit to do that work? Like you'd have an executive director and staff and an overhead and a building, rent, not that you can do it out of your back pocket for free.
Yeah. What are you thinking?
This is just a general thing that just popped in my head. So my organizations are all volunteer-led, like I'm a volunteer. For grants, do you have to have paid staff? Or is that just general, like if you get a lot of money, you obviously want more? Or,
You're not required to. You don't have to have paid staff. But we also have to think about what is the value of a volunteer hour. What is it? Do you know what it is at? Lately, I haven't read. It's over $30.
It's over $30 an hour. And that's one way for smaller organizations to show the scope of their work.
Independent sector puts out a number every year, and I want to say it's around $38 an hour, but don't quote me on that. But again, if you look up the value of a volunteer hour, independent sector, it'll tell you. So if you're a volunteer-driven organization, maybe you just have a couple staff, think about that scope. And again, if you are doing a grant that requires matching funds, oftentimes funders will allow you to use the value of those volunteer hours as your match. So these are the conversations you want to have with that program officer.
Or with the impact that you're having as a volunteer organization, that just day-to-day volunteers do the work, the board members. But if there's like an activity or you have a vision to do this one thing really well, maybe you do pay someone part-time to manage it. And maybe there's a beginning and an end, or then you have to, it's part of the planning. Are we now a staffed organization? You can't, it's all about context. You can't just go from one grant to another. Like, what is your vision for the organization long-term? And you can't just hire and fire people willy-nilly.
Yeah, that gets rough in the sector. So before you begin your grant process and you sit down to do your budget, you really have to understand what's your big idea. Most of us write grants related to a specific program or thing. Some sort of a capital need, a new program, a revised program that we're trying to expand and grow, right? That's typically why we're writing grants. So we have to have a deep understanding of our big idea, which goes back to what we said earlier about thinking about how does the staff connect if you have a large staffed organization? Does the program staff actually talk to the development office? Does the development office actually talk to the finance office? Bring the team together and have these conversations.
Some organizations, the grants office is separate from the fundraising office.
In larger organizations, yeah. And as you think about that, and if it's just you and you're saying, I'm the only one, because most of you represent very small organizations, and you're saying, I'm it, build a team.
Yeah.
Bring in other people who are on your board. Bring in some of your key volunteers. Have them help you talk through your big idea. Why? Because that diversity of voices in the room is going to raise different questions.
Bring in clients.
Yeah.
Someone with experience.
Lived experience. Yeah.
That knows what it's like. So Tamala sort of talked about growing a program, a new program. So a grant is most likely for something that's new, showing growth. That's why you have the individual supports for operations. You're rarely going to get a grant to do the same thing over and over again, year after year. So a grant would be, I always say, like a cherry on top of the sundae. You have the sundae, this is something new, and it's not forever funding. There's going to be a beginning and an end. And once that grant is over, there's the expectation, the jargon is institutionalized. We're going to keep doing this work as part of operations, and then it's not new, and you're going to keep it going.
There's usually a question on a grant application about sustainability. How will you sustain this? And again, not all funders are created equal. Some will fund certain programs for a period of time. I remember when I got hired at Flat River Outreach Ministries in Lowell, it was an organization that for 11 years had run, 11 or 12, had run totally on volunteers. And I remember meeting with the program officer from the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, because they had the Lowell Fund was under the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. And she sat in my office and she said to me, you know, our expectations have changed now that you're here.
Oh.
This organization has professionalized. You're a professional executive director, because I had a track record in the field. Our expectations have shifted. Okay, let's talk about what that really means, right? I also remember her saying to me, we are not going to continue to fund you if you don't diversify your board. And I said, what do you mean by diversity? I don't know if anybody knows Lowell. Talk about a white community.
Height, maybe?
We served, the school district was our service area. She said, well, you need people of color on your board. I said, we literally have 2 families of color in our school district. Which one would you like me to tokenize? And I flat out said that to her. And she just sort of stopped and looked at me, and I said, I'm all about having the conversation around diversity. But what else does that mean?
Yeah.
So I took a risk. I called her out on it. It worked out okay. I was lucky. It's not always easy to take that risk, especially if we are a person from a historically marginalized community. It is not always easy to take that risk. That's why those relationships matter. Because if you have good relationship, you can do a little more risk. Yeah. So,
Well,
you want to talk about the RFP a little bit?
okay, so a lot of grants, there'll be a request for proposal, an RFP, where they outline, or there's guidelines for the grant. The donor will talk about what it is they want to see. And just like in any other system, the people before you did good things and bad things. And you're looking at a device that's trying to get the right information in the right way so a decision can be made. And your job as the grant writer is to be an expert in those guidelines. There could be a lot of different things, character counts, percentage of administration that is allowed, budget templates, they want the numbers in a certain way. Like in your organization, you have it set up one way, you're gonna have to translate it into a different way. Matching amounts, how long the grant goes for. Some funders like to put the money up front, they front load it. They'll give you 75% of the funding in the first year, and then it goes down from year to year, which is sort of helps with the sustainability, saying, well, you're gonna start filling in the difference with your other funding. So there's gonna be a document and rules most likely provided by the donor or best practices that you're gonna be expected to follow. And one person really does need to be in charge of that process.
Especially if you're doing government grants. And the one thing to really pay attention to if you're doing government grants, very few government grants will front load. Oftentimes, government grants will ask you to spend the money and they will reimburse.
Right, that's even different.
It's
So
a
they're not
cash
even
flow
giving you
question.
a chunk of money.
Right.
They're reimbursing you for the money you've spent. That's pretty privileged, thinking that you have cash flow to take on these expenses. And how long does it take the government to reimburse you? Because they're super efficient in the government.
I'm sure city staff is great.
Yeah, and the Kent County is amazing.
It takes time. Sometimes I've had experiences where it can take as much as 6 months. Do you have the cash flow to navigate that?
Or are you gonna bankrupt yourself?
Right.
We have a question.
Question online. Can you talk a little about strategies, relationship building, what worked well for you and what did not?
Relationship building with funders? I'm assuming that's specifically?
Well, we covered that a little bit. Well, in, me sitting down and talking in the beginning of the process, as you're drafting the proposal, I will send the proposal, like I'm gonna send it to Huntington Bank and say, I drafted this proposal, does this look good to you? And they'll give me a couple pointers to change my language to agree with what their bosses are looking for. They're not changing the program, they want me to use the phrase workforce development because they have workforce development grants. So you have to say the words, a certain phrase. So that's that relationship process where you can communicate throughout the grant writing.
I think probably my two biggest tips on relationship building with any funder, whether it's an individual donor or an institutional funder, my two biggest things would be transparency. Be willing to be vulnerable enough to be honest. It's scary. If I don't know something, I'm going to tell my funder I don't know something. And I might even ask them for help to figure it out. So be willing to be vulnerable enough to be transparent and honest. My second big piece of advice would be get really curious. Ask questions. Learn. Invite your donor, your funder, to be a thought partner. Get really curious. And I would say that's true of anybody. You know, when my daughter was younger and I worked for the Salvation Army, I was a major gift officer for the Salvation Army in a large part of western Michigan, northern Indiana. And, you know, my kids, I don't know, 9, 10, she's trying to figure out what mom does for a living, right? And I said to her one day, I said, I kind of get paid to meet with folks of an older age, and I go out to lunch with them, or I go into their homes and I have tea and cookies and we chat. She's like, really, Mom, that's what you do? Yes, because I'm trying to build relationship. Why? So I eventually can ask them to give a greater gift. I invite them. If I have relationship, I'm inviting someone to invest in a dream. I'm inviting someone to invest in their values, right, as a fundraiser. So foundations are people too, right? I'm inviting a foundation to invest in something. It's relational. So those would be my two big pieces of advice. I will say, when I was coming up in the field, I'm old. And part of the reason I probably have gotten more bold is I'm old. You just lose those inhibitions as you age. It's like, who cares? Although my friends tell me I've always been bold. One year, many, many years ago, I told a colleague at the Salvation Army, we were talking about New Year's resolutions. And she said, do you have one? And I said, yeah, I decided this year I want to be more bold. And she looked at me, she said, oh my God, the world can't handle you being more bold. Why not? So, sorry, I got sidetracked.
Well,
what was I talking about?
I would like to say that sort of even context with the relationships is every nonprofit is started by a person with a dream. And there's going to be a point in the organization's growth where it's about the person and what they want, or it's about the mission and the community. And each way is fine. You can have an organization that's like a vanity project and it's your thing and you're telling your story and you're doing good work, or you're going to evolve and be a completely different organization than you thought of when you started, that grows with input from the donors, and grows with input from the community and your partners and your board. And if that sounds exciting, you'll get more people involved and there'll be more funding most likely. But each one is fine. But how are you able to accommodate that input? Funding, advice, activities, the people you're helping, or the trees that you're saving? Which way do you want to go?
I mean, you can even host town hall style meetings. Invite people in. Say, what do you think about X, Y, Z?
But then they're going to have advice for you. How do you handle that? Because people don't like to give advice that isn't accommodated somehow and listened to somehow.
Lots of different ways to navigate that.
Well, one final thing, like a practical thing with government grants and budgeting and the RFP, in the state of Michigan, you'll be creating a budget for a project and you'll have computers to do a suicide prevention program. And where do you put it? Where do you put a computer? And the budget it sounds like equipment, But for the state of Michigan, equipment is $5,000 or more, each individual item. And then you're getting into some of these larger institutions, it's almost like a purchasing system that they have accommodated. And it fits within how the state of Michigan, with you, they're buying services to save the world. They're also buying dump trucks. And it's the same thing to them. They're just writing lots of checks. And when you're in, there's a deadline, and you're trying to fill out this budget, and you put in $1,000 because you want to buy a computer in this budget line, and there's an error message, but it's not going to tell you what it is. You have to build in some flexibility in your time and see the big picture and try to understand. Like maybe that was mentioned on the 37th page, on the third paragraph, that equipment is $5,000 and above.
Of your 65-page RFP that you fell asleep trying to
Yeah,
read.
they fell asleep writing it.
Yeah. So that's why it helps to do this with a team.
Yeah,
Even just a writing partner, right? It really makes a big difference to have someone help. And the big thing to think about before you start writing your grant is how are you going to manage it? When I was at Flat River Outreach Ministries, we were awarded a $33,000 state grant. The only reason we applied for that grant was one of our key community partners came to us and said, here's why we think we should be in this program. And we said, sure. So we calculated based on Lowell what our pot of the big pot of state funding should be. And we got awarded a $33,000 grant. That $33,000 state grant required me to hire a part-time person to manage all the reporting. Because there was so much reporting every month, every 6 months, every year, that I had to have someone. And so organizationally, we were in a position where we could absorb that and we could afford that. Not everybody is. But it led to so many other things. And actually, the next smallest grant that the state gave for that particular funding was $500,000. We got 33,000. The next smallest was $500,000. We were the little dogs in the game.
but it's good to be the little dog.
But it led to so many other relationships and partnerships. And I actually, as the director of the organization, got asked to speak at a state conference because they were so amazed with the local partnerships that we had developed for that 33,000. So you never know. And I believe more than a decade later, they're still getting funding from that same program. It just increases every year.
And there'll be sometimes in a proposal, they'll ask, like, what type of financial capacity, financial management capacity do you have? Please write 250 characters about that. Like, it's serious business.
And pay attention if it's character limit or word limit.
Yeah. So for smaller nonprofits and startups, I would create a separate business account. Like, you don't want to mix the grants and the nonprofit funds in your checking account, and then it all fades away pretty quickly. And that's part of the grant management. What's the funds for the grant? You're a nonprofit. You have an account with a check register, and you can see the money's coming in and out. It just at that basic level, it could really save you a lot of grief.
So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to systems management. So we want to just briefly talk about financial controls in your organization. So when we think about financial controls, there's both internal and external, right? So we're going to go through these kind of fast, but we just want to give you a sense as you think about when I budget for a grant, a program, am I budgeting for the financial controls that have to go along with that program? So you have to be thoughtful about that. So on these slides, you'll see the things that are in bold are things that your board should be paying attention to. So there's context here. This is both overall in your organization, and this is specifically in your grant. Okay?
So this is more than the board saying, you need to get a grant.
Okay, board, what are you going to do about X, Y, Z?
Yeah. Who are you
Right?
talking to?
I had a development staff person call me one time when I was at the Johnson Center. She was with a fairly sizable, sizable in terms of service and annual revenue, but only had like 3 staff people. And she was in tears, and she said, the board just asked if I would write 16 grants every month. And I'm like, are there even 16 foundations that you fit with? Like, how does that even make sense?
Yeah.
Goes back to that context setting. What's our revenue mix, right? So we want to be mindful when we're doing a budget for the program for a specific grant. Do we have a structure in place in our organization, like a finance committee that can be helpful for that? How does that budget for our grant, our program, fit into the organizational budget that the board sees? And how do they understand that, right? So this is where we have to help create those connections for people. We have to help our boards understand. A budget is important because it helps us forecast financially. So for our program, as we're writing that budget out that's going to become part of our grant application, do we fully understand what those costs are going to be? Now, sometimes it's a guess, but I hope it's an educated guess.
You're looking at trends.
Yeah, research, do some
envi-
research.
The economy, how's the economy doing?
Right. So again, involve other people in this process. If you have a finance committee, if you have a program committee, like involve other people in this process and think about some of those questions. We want to be really careful when we're doing a grant budget in particular, that it's grounded in reality. That doesn't mean we can't dream a little, but we have to be grounded in reality. It's a hard phone call to make, because I've had to make them, when you have to call a funder and say, yeah, we're not anywhere close. Like impact. I remember walking into a job one time where we were in the middle of a grant cycle that someone else had written, and I sat down and I looked at what they said they would do, what they promised. I could not for the life of me figure out where they came up with any of the numbers. None of them made sense to me based on what the organization was doing. I'm like, where did these come from? There was no way we would be anywhere close to what they had promised. I had the hard job of calling the funder halfway through a grant cycle and having that conversation. It's hard. So pay attention to that when you're doing your grant budget.
I came into a nonprofit organization, and they had run a capital campaign, and they believed that they had to take those capital funds to fill the budget, a budget deficit for the organization. And what does that do with relationships with donors for a decade or two? But these people remember, because that's a betrayal of trust.
Big time. So organizationally, we have lots of different external reporting we have to do. When we're writing a grant budget, we're going to oftentimes have to submit some sort of a report to the institutional funder that gave us the money, right? Those will look different depending on the institutional funder. Federal, state, sometimes county grants may have more reporting, meaning more often and more detail. Some family foundations may have very little reporting. Know that going in. Why? Because it's going to matter how you budget for that time. Every bit of reporting takes somebody's time. What have you budgeted for that? So you have to be mindful of that. So we also have a lot of internal reporting. How are you reporting about the success of your program internally? To a committee, to the board, to stakeholders, who do you need to report to internally?
At the YMCA, we have a monthly meeting where we have these grants that we're getting. They're restricted funds. They're restricted to do the activity that was funded, but we have a variety of grants doing a variety of different activities. And we're such a large organization, every month we sit and say, like, why hasn't this grant been spent down? Why hasn't it been spent down? We're halfway through the year. It should be half spent down. like what's going on. It's a check and balance that, because the people doing the work may have thought, well, you know, there's not enough kids to help. Like, we need to find more kids. There are the people doing the work, it's not sometimes their focus to spend the money like the people that are raising it want it to happen.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's really important, again, this is why I encourage you, even if you're a single shingle shop, right? If you're it at your organization, how do you bring that team around you? Right? Some volunteers, so that you can have some of these internal check-ins.
Maybe a small business owner, someone that works, a branch manager at a local bank that is a little more numbers focused, that can help, that can be objective.
If you're working with a school system, one of the best people I ever had on a finance committee was the school superintendent. That guy was amazing. And so helpful to think about things that I never in a million years would have thought about. So yeah, we have to be mindful of that. We also have to pay attention to how are we managing the control of all these things, right? What are those systems that we have in place to manage something internally? Do we know how long we have to keep documents? What does document storage look like for our organization? Because we may have to have that for reporting. All of those types of pieces.
If you're doing an event with cash, buying tickets, how are you managing that cash?
How are you protecting the assets of the organization? And to Stephen's point about having a separate account, if you don't have a separate checking account, what sort of, are you using something like QuickBooks that allows you to segment what pot of money is being spent, right? So these are those internal controls that you have to pay attention to. There are generally accepted accounting principles, we call them GAAP practices, that you can look up online. So if you are an organization, as you continue to grow, there may come a point in time where you have to have an audit. And that's what they're going to be looking at. So you can look up those practices and think about how are we managing those internal controls. That's trust building for the donor. They want to make sure the money's being used wisely and in the way that we said it would be used.
So if you're larger, you would want to have a bookkeeper, and then there's the need to have an accountant to do an audit.
And part of this is about protecting the organization's reputation. Sometimes what we have is our reputation, and we need to make sure that we're building that trust constantly in the community.
So as we take all those ideas of the financial environment of an organization, you can see that, like, you're doing one activity, but all the other parts that support it are connected. So there's some website of these shared expenses. You're not doing a one thing that's separate from everything else. And you need all of these supporting functions funded. So every cost is part of that mission that you're doing. And you want to be transparent about what the costs are, and you also need to know what your costs are. And keep telling that story of you're buying this activity with a grant, but it's supported by all these other things.
So if you're doing a children's program that requires printed workbooks, that printing is a mission-focused cost. It's a program cost, right, for those workbooks. So how are you paying attention to all of these costs when you do your budget? Do you stop and think about the fact that, oh, in order to do this program, we have to send a mailing out? What about postage? What about envelopes to put the mailing in? What about getting stuff printed? Those are all related costs. So you have to think about that. And this is where you have to pay attention to the RFP, What is administrative cost? What will they allow? What are program costs, right? Sometimes funders will put limits on what's allowed for administration. To Stephen's point, pay attention that for the state of Michigan, if it's not over $5,000, it's not an equipment cost. So where do I put it on that budget sheet? Right? This is where you want to pay attention to some of those things.
And for like personnel and staff, most staff at a nonprofit are going to be program costs because they're doing the program. And even the executive director is spending some part of her time working on the programming. So like at the Creative Youth Center, it was either rent or staff costs. The only program costs were like pencils and erasers and crayons. So the staff had to be program costs because there's no program without the staff.
All right, so we are going to put you to work. All right.
This is what a nonprofit budget would look like. It's one page. You're collapsing a lot of different expenses into pretty broad categories. So what we're doing is, like at Grand Valley, we would have these budget reports of expenses, and they'd be really long and very detailed. And what I do to create a document that's understandable to a layperson is sort of collapse these things down. So office supplies, you don't want to say I bought a pencil and then I also am going to buy a folder. And travel and mileage, you're not going to say we went this way and we went here and we went here. And you're going to see that the revenue and expenses balance because we're not getting a profit and we're not going to lose money. We're going to magically come up to a zero. And then you're going to have income that offsets the expenses. And that's where we're talking about the different varieties of revenue that you have in your organization. Earned revenue, ticket fees, in-kind support for staff doing things, or donated computers. And that makes it, that's the big picture, and it makes it more resilient.
Donated space has a dollar value, right?
Keeping track of where you spend your monies and categorizing them in QuickBooks to line up with these budget expense lines will make it really easy. Like, how much does it cost? You're going to go work with kids. How am I going to get there? Are they coming here? Do I have to rent a bus? Do I have to rent a van? Are there volunteers? I need insurance. They go down, 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 down. And maybe we do sometimes doing a test case or a pilot project. I can't do a $750,000 project with all the different schools in the city. Maybe I can do one school. See if it works. Funder might be interested to know, like, hey, we did it once with volunteers. We'd like funding to do it with 5 schools, and then work with you to see how it works. And then we'll bring it out citywide in 5 years.
And if you're working with volunteers, think about, do I need to train them? I know when I was at Flat River Outreach, we were making some shifts in the way that we were doing intake, people who would come in for service. And we realized we really needed to train our volunteers. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out what's the training they needed, and we ended up giving them a coaching seminar. Why? Because it teaches you how to listen, how to ask questions. And I remember the person who was sort of in charge of all of our volunteers for the area being a little bit pessimistic about this. She was not happy when we started going through this training. And I sort of mandated it. If you're going to work in the program over the next year, you have to actually go through this training at some point in the next 6 months. And I could tell she didn't want to do it. And at the end of the program, she said, I was really skeptical about this, but I see how it can work. And 6 months later, she walked into my office one day and said, wow, I can't believe the difference. You know, but we had to get funding. And at first, it was really expensive for us because we had a lot of volunteers that needed to go through training all at once. And so we said to the foundation, we'll continue this and we can absorb the cost of a small number of volunteers each year, but we couldn't do the large cost of everybody each year. So, this is where you have to start to think about what are those needs that we have, and even if I'm working with volunteers, are they equipped to do the work in the way we need them to do the work?
You bring in someone to do some training, you send one person out to get top-notch training, and then it's the train-their-trainer model.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
just
You build capacity in your organization.
thinking through what it is you need, the big picture, get some help from people that think differently, that you can get the really good outcomes.
Got an online question.
Yeah, we have a nice comment online. One area of the conversation that our group had was the development of stories to our target population. I find this very powerful because of our ability to figure out needs and levers and what we can pull where resources can be allocated.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. Stories are so incredibly important. And you've heard us mention stories. The reality is, the grant application as a whole is a story. The budget is a piece of that story. So when we do a budget in a grant application, we have the numbers, we have a form that we typically plug in our numbers, right? We've done our work, we've calculated, we've figured out what it's going to cost, and we plug in our numbers. But there's also a narrative. There's an opportunity to say, what do these mean? And think about what's the story we're telling with our numbers. And that narrative becomes really important. And most grant applications, a budget narrative is a separate section. So you have your budget sheet, you fill in all your numbers, and then you get to talk about those numbers, right?
So let's say you need someone to coordinate the work. And right here on this budget template, there's salaries, and you'll have a number. In the narrative, you'll say, this person will have this title, they'll work this many hours, how many days. You might even say, how are you going to hire them? Are they someone on staff? You promise to hire them within 30 days of getting the grant. Do you have a way to hire people? Do you have an HR department? How do you know that it's going to be equitable to get the right person, not just your friends doing the work? You might say under evaluation, $1,000. Who is going to evaluate? Is it internal, external? You're hiring a consultant? Are there any fees involved or expenses involved? Is it software that you're paying for? Is it a person? Equipment. Is it a laptop that you're buying? Is it used? You're going to get, is it 3 iPads or 1 laptop? And the person reading it, like I said, the rich people get rich because they know numbers, and the readers have seen thousands and thousands of budgets, so they know what sort of is suitable. And they're looking for ways. Sometimes the people that are reading the proposal have to look for ways not to fund you. And they're looking for inconsistencies in the budget, things that don't make sense, fluff, ways you've sort of padded the budget to get what you need. And to you it's padding, to them it's waste. And the narrative is a way to show why you think this is the right thing and why you think this is a good use of the funding.
So a few things you want to think about with your narrative. Be concise. Clear up any assumptions. We don't want someone reviewing this application to make assumptions. Now again, if you have a relationship with a funder and they're not certain about something, oftentimes they'll pick up the phone and call and ask, or they'll send you an email. And they'll say, help me understand this, clear this up. This is why it's important to give yourself time. If you're not certain about something and you're looking at this going, I don't know which category this fits in, I'm not 100% certain where to fit it. Ask the question, reach out to the funder. They much prefer that than you guessing and them having to fix it later. And the thing we have to realize about program officers is, depending on the foundation, a program officer may have 200 grants that have come in for that particular cycle. And those 200 grants might equal $10 million. I don't know, I'm just throwing out a number. They only have $5 million to give. Their job as a program officer is to filter through all of that information and say, what's the best risk for our foundation? And then oftentimes they'll write what's called a brief. At the Johnson Center, we used to teach a class called Persuasive Writing for grant program officers. Why? Because they have to write a brief to persuade the grant committee or the board of trustees, who's ever making that decision, that this is what we should fund. So if you can get to know that program officer, it's going to help you tremendously. So you don't want to create any assumptions. You want to make sure that you're clearing up any potential assumptions. You want to make sure that you're creating a picture with that narrative. You need them to be able to feel and see this program.
See it in operation just through the numbers and the narrative.
Yeah. And as Stephen mentioned, think about, what are those job duties, the time. It's really about how did we calculate these expenses. This is a way for you to show your work, right?
In federal grants, they want to not only know what percentage of time the staff is going to, like Casey spends 10% on the grant, then they want to know what she's doing with the rest of her time, what other grant allocations her time, because it would be easy for her to show 200% of her time being dedicated to grants, and that's not fair to the government to paying her twice as much.
And if you're wondering about how do we calculate that time, so a really easy way to do it is create an Excel spreadsheet and do this for 2 weeks out of the year. It doesn't have to be every week, right? 2 weeks out of the year. If you have an accountant, talk to your accountant. I think it's a good time of year, whatever. But create an Excel spreadsheet. And we used to do this with my staff when I was at a bunch of different organizations. And you have categories. If you have 4 programs, each program is a category. How much time is I spending on fundraising? What's actually going to administration? And do 15-minute increments. And for 2 weeks, document where am I spending my time? And then you keep that, because that becomes your proof document, right? It's not about, oh my gosh, I have to sit here every day and count all my minutes, right? Same thing, if you are in a building and your building is multi-use and you have different uses, you can calculate based on square footage what percentage of the building goes to each program. So then you can think about it's this percentage of heating and all of those things, right? So there's ways to do this that make it a little bit easier for us to keep track of things.
Or maybe with a volunteer organization like the Junior Chamber, and the people are pretty flaky, and you can't get the outcomes.
Hey, I'm a former JC. I'm
So
careful.
maybe a stipend, like $250, like to do this work, we'll pay you $250. And then that would go in the budget, and you would say, like, I know it's a volunteer organization. We're trying to make sure that this project happens, and everyone's very busy. We think that the money's not going to make anyone rich, but it just shows that there's a value.
Small appreciation. Yeah.
Another way, you could be working on your budget, and you wrote the proposal with 2 coordinators, but as you're going through the budget to make everything balance and the size of the grant, you think, I really need a 3rd person to make it all balance and fit. And you can justify that in the narrative, but you need to go back to the proposal and make sure the narrative in what you're promising shows 3 people and not 2 or 1 or 4.
And these are just some quick examples that we just wanted to share.
Sort of what it
Probably a
sort of
little hard
looks
to read.
like.
Yeah. So like teacher stipends, $600 each, and we're going to have 20 teachers, right? So you're just letting the funder know, here's how this money is being used.
So you're not spending $12,000 on one teacher, because
Right.
they could just see the number. Teacher stipends, 12,000, is it 2?
Is it
is it
8? Is it, right?
1,000 teachers?
Yeah.
They wouldn't know
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah. So they want to see that. If you're paying staff and your staff has fringe benefits, you can calculate that, right?
And then how do you come up with these numbers?
Yeah. And that's where, like, if you do that 2-week time study, that's where you save that, and that's kind of your proof document. Does this make sense? How are we
For
doing online?
Federal grants, they'll allow an organization to request a indirect cost rate above the 10% that's normally allowed, but you have to justify that every year. And there's a process for that. So a lot of this is negotiation.
And that's where having that relationship matters, because you can ask some of those questions, okay? So we just have a few final tips as we're finishing things up
5
here.
minutes worth?
So just a few things. So common challenges that people have is their ability to estimate. Some of this takes practice, especially if we're a young organization, we're not used to things. So this is where it's helpful to build that team. Talk to people doing similar types of work.
Yeah, colleagues at other organizations.
Yep. Ask board members, hey, do you have any experience in this? Is this something you can help us estimate? So this is where that team really
The
helps.
technical term is guesstimate.
Educated guessing.
Yeah.
So,
We're
yeah.
proposing. This is what
It
we
is a
think the
proposal.
future will look like.
Yes.
So
And we don't know what's going to happen with cost. I mean, who
Yeah.
knew that eggs were going to get so expensive, you know?
are you buying furniture, and then you have the ability to get the furniture donated. The
Right.
donor's not going to say, don't get perfectly good furniture donated, but then you can allocate the funding. One trick is if your expenses that you proposed are 10% different, you really need, 10% is a good number, you really need to go back to the donor and say, hey, we thought we were going to spend $10,000, it's getting to $12,000, we just want to let you know that this is happening.
And if you have a whole category, like if you budgeted to purchase furniture and you got it in kind, that's a good opportunity to go back to the funder and say, hey, we have this great in-kind gift. We just wanted to let you know we're going to shift that $10,000 we thought we were buying furniture to this area. And we just, again, transparency, keep them in the loop. This is a partner. Don't wait till next year when your grant report's due to tell them everything that happened. It's partnership. So some other things that we notice people run into challenges with is they don't think about the full project. They think for this grant. Now, most people will not fund 100% of a project.
Right.
They're going to ask you in a grant application, who are your other donors? What's secured? What's not? Right?
That's
They're
where
gonna-
the in-kind support comes in,
Matters, yeah.
where you have $3,500 of in-kind from volunteers at $38 an hour. That makes the project larger, which makes the grant a smaller percentage of the overall project.
So this is where you also have to be careful in your grant planning, because if your project is going to cost you $10,000 and you write 4 different $10,000 grants, what happens if you get them all? You just got $40,000 for a $10,000 project. Be thoughtful about what you're doing in that regard.
And the way the donors handle that is on this budget, you'll see there's 2 columns under the funding is committed or pending. So it's good to have money in hand, like the DeVosses came in and they want to support me for $20,000 on this $50,000 project. I also have $30,000 pending of requests, or even at Grand Valley, we would have prospects at 3-to-1. So if we were going to needed to raise $1 million, we needed to have $3 million of prospective gifts to go after, because you're not going to be successful every time, even me.
And there's, depending on, there's like if you're doing a big campaign and you're trying to raise a lot, there's campaign calculators online, and it'll be anywhere from 3 to 5 prospects for every 1 gift.
So that's a lot of people you're talking to.
Now, if you want to raise your success rate on your foundation grants, do your research really well. And if you reach
We
out
have
to a foundation
5
and
more
they
seconds.
say, okay, we're going to go over a minute. If you reach out to a foundation and they say, we really are not a good match, chances are pretty slim, please don't send the grant.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time and their time. That's a good time to ask a question. Do you know another foundation that I might be talking to, right? So be thoughtful. We talked a lot about tracking systems, those internal, external controls.
Deadlines, who you
Deadlines.
asked for, what you asked for in the past.
So one final thing, and this is my pet peeve, I will acknowledge that. Write well. Now, if English is a second language, this can be hard. This is where having someone else read your grant matters. So there is a handout in there that has a bunch of tips on how do we write well, and it also has resources, books that you can read. So I'll give you 2 tips that are probably the easiest thing. Most people have a tendency to write in what we call passive voice. And when you read it, it doesn't feel engaging, it feels a little flat, and we're not sure why. Best way to decide if you're writing in passive voice, if you are using Microsoft Word, go up in the right-hand corner where it says Find, there's a little magnifying glass, and type ING. Because if you're writing in passive voice, you are likely using a whole lot of ING words. He was walking instead of he walked down the street. And when you have that a lot in a document, it feels flat. And sometimes we'll read it and we can't figure out why it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't excite me, right? You want an active voice in your grant writing because you want to engage the reader. So that's one quick tip. My other quick tip for you is if you do not have someone else to read your stuff and you don't have time or you don't have another person who can read it and help you edit, print it out and read it aloud. Research tells us that we have better comprehension when we are reading off paper than if we're reading off a screen. And if you read something aloud, I'm a fantastic editor, but don't ask me to edit my own work. Why? Because the brain fills in the gaps. I mean, I can literally pick up a document and not even read it and spot all the typos in it. My own work? Nope, don't even notice. But if I read it aloud, I trip over the stuff that isn't right. Mm-hmm. So those are my top 2 tips for you when you're writing. Take time to do that edit process. It's okay if your first draft stinks. You can write multiple drafts of a grant.
And they keep evolving as you go.
Yeah.
For the same project.
So we did just want to mention a couple of potential resources for you. We talked about some things. We mentioned Logic Model Workbook with Kellogg Foundation. There's Council of Michigan Foundation puts out a common grant application. If you are new to grant writing,
this is the
budget
budget
sheet.
of.
I recommend you just take time to write a grant and share it with somebody. Ask how it looks. There's also a book written by Nancy Smith, who's actually here from West Michigan, The Complete Book of Grant Writing. And then Stephen puts together a group called the Grant Writers Roundtable, and they meet monthly, so you can join that group on Facebook.
Ooh, okay. Networking. And if you're looking along the lines of grants, you go, there's a book of lists that the chamber, Grand Rapids Chamber has put together, and in that book of lists, it has all the major industries in town, and there's a page on foundations. And so it lists all the major foundations, and I have a copy with me so you can see it before you guys go. So there's a list of all the major foundations. So if you're looking to get to know one of those foundations, you can do a letter of inquiry. You can go to their website, peruse it, find out what issues and causes that they support, and there's usually a place where you can say, I want to send in a letter of inquiry. And you would register, and then you would send them information about your organization. And if it aligns with what they're doing, they'll reach out to you. And if they do reach out to you, I would say make friends with the gatekeeper, the person that answers the phone. They can always give you information if you ask good questions. And that is the way that I've come to know better. Some of the foundations that we work with is getting to know the gatekeeper for sure. But as far as networking is concerned, I'm a member of the Econ Club. Going to those types of events, many times some of the same people that you want to know about your organization are at these events. So I would definitely encourage that as well. And then us in the room, come up to us and ask us questions. We can tell you who some of the key people are at different organizations and who to reach out to.
Everything that she said. And depending on, the size of the foundation, some foundations do have program officers that are at times more accessible and visible in the community. Foundations are set up different, especially corporate foundations, private family foundations, all the different types. But if you're able to, go to their website, if they have, a list of their program officers, I would say definitely just start there with an introductory email and conversation, letting them know that you'd like to share about the mission of your organization. Definitely do some research to see what their priorities are, and even maybe take a look at what other organizations they have funded that might be like yours, so that you can just speak to them, from a place of knowledge, but also exploring, a potential partnership with them. So it all starts with a conversation that hopefully you're able to have. But if you can't, definitely submit like a letter of inquiry. Sometimes they take those unsolicited. Sometimes they do have a RFP, so a certain time of year that they'll take those inquiries. But it never hurts to try, and really your LOI could be a blanket LOI that you just, send out to several organization or several foundations if you're just trying to at least get somewhere.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. That covered it well.
One thing I could add would be there are sort of systemic community committees like fighting homelessness or fighting poverty or improving early childhood education, and take your skills and abilities and the work of your organization and join some of these cross-community collaborations and get your voice into the discussions about the work that you're doing, and collaborate with other organizations and be seen as a thought leader. And they'll come to you. Sometimes it's, everyone thinks I need to go out and find these people. You want to draw them to you. It's for a more authentic conversation.
So this is sort of a general overall thing, but you would be maybe surprised at how often it happens. It's not uncommon for someone to get to the end of reading a grant and go, I still have no idea what you're talking about. I really don't know what you're trying to accomplish. Concise writing is so important. In the handout that we gave you about writing tips at the end of the workshop, I highly recommend there are some resources on the back of that page, books that you can pick up to help you learn to write more effectively. So good writing matters because you are sharing a story with your written words. And if you don't know how to craft a story, this is also why it's so incredibly important for you, especially if you're new to grant writing. Write a grant, hand it to someone who knows nothing about your organization, and ask them if they understand what you're trying to accomplish. Because when we write, we make assumptions. It's like I can't edit my own work because my brain sees what's supposed to be there. We make assumptions when we write a grant that they know things about us, and they don't. So I think that's probably the number one challenge. I've also read some interesting studies that have been done on grant makers' pet peeves. Grammar matters. If I have to read a sentence 4 times and I don't understand what you're saying in the sentence, we're in trouble. So those are some of the little things I would note.
Some foundations and even like United Way as well, they'll host like info sessions prior to their RFP opening. And that is a great opportunity to hear exactly from them what, not necessarily like what they want in the grant, but like how you can write a successful grant. What needs to be included. They'll, even oftentimes give you an example, a template, or how they want certain things to look. So I would say take advantage of those opportunities to hear exactly from them about their process. And also, most recently, the Grand Haven Area Community Foundation, which this was awesome. They were like, hey, you can send us your application or your grant proposal. We'll review it and provide any feedback that we think would be helpful prior to putting your proposal in front of the board. Not all foundations do that, but those that do, take advantage of those opportunities.
So most grants, whether they're federal grants or private grants, have character restrictions. Please abide by those character restrictions or margins. All of that will affect whether they'll read it or it'll get approved. So when they say 2,000 characters, 2,000 or less. So just keep that in mind.
Write it in a Word document.
Yes, write it in a Word document first and cut and paste it.
When you maybe are going to these introductory workshops by like an agency or a foundation or speaking to the program officer, we'll say like speak concisely, don't use jargon, but if that expert is talking to you and they're using jargon, reflect that back to them. It's sort of like in school, you'd repeat what the professor said. Because there could be cutting edge research that they know about that maybe you're not familiar with and you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. Another point is with assumptions, part of our process is to educate the reader. They may have assumptions about the poverty rates of the southeast corner of Grand Rapids, or where what's happening with the parks in Grand Rapids, and they may be operating on 20-year-old assumptions when they were emerging as professionals. So we have to educate them and break through their prejudices or the lazy thinking they have, and get them up to speed as quickly as possible to what you're trying to do.
So when we think about word limits and character limits, if you have 2,000 word limit and it only takes you 500 to tell your story well, that's okay. Keep in mind, at large foundations, program officers might be reading through a stack of 200 different grant applications. They appreciate this isn't about fluff. Grant writing is not a place to do the brainstorming. You do that on your worksheet, your logic model worksheet beforehand. And then you get very concise in your telling. The other thing is when you're thinking about, the details of grant writing and the budget presentation, this transparency matters. Like, be really honest. And that's why having those conversations beforehand make a big difference, because you can clarify questions. Don't use your grant application as a brainstorming process. You should have all that information distilled before you get there.
Like a grant writing budget, or just like a
organizational budget?
Organizational budget or, oh, across the board.
Okay. I have one.
Okay.
Tatum's looking at me going, what should I tell them? We've known each other way too long. So here's my number one tip when you're working with a limited budget, and I don't care if it's on a program, organizationally, et cetera, collaborate. We cannot do this work alone, and I don't care how great your organization is. Even amazing organizations like ICCF and the Women's Resource Center that have both been around for a long time, the Y, they've been around a long time. They're big organizations in our community, big for nonprofits, even when you look across the country. Vast majority of nonprofits in this country are tiny. Budgets of less than $500,000 for the majority of nonprofits in this country. That's a limited budget. It doesn't allow you to have a lot of staff. Collaboration is key. Look around the community, say who's working in the same space, either same mission type work, are we dealing with homelessness, or same audience, are we working with school children? Figure out where you can build those partnerships. It's the best way to stretch your budget, and funders love collaboration. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
I'm going to say amen to all of that. Collaboration is huge. We've, as an organization that has been in the community a long time, we have collaborated with lots of other similar nonprofits to come together and be able to fund a project. The current building that we live in now, or that we reside in now, is on Martin Luther King Jr. Street, 415. In that building, you have 2 floors of affordable housing. You have the YMCA Early Childhood Center. Our headquarters are there, and Madison Church. And so we all collaborated, fundraised together to be able to pull that project together, because none of us probably could have done that on our own. And and like she says, funders love that.
I can take a different tack. It doesn't cost it doesn't cost a lot of money to write clearly. Doesn't cost a lot of money to have a very simple, accurate, clear website. It doesn't cost a lot of money to be disciplined, to do what you say you're going to do, to be very focused on your mission and focus on your clients, and start small and grow the impact and grow the relationships.
Sorry, I'm not. I got one too. Yeah, I like what you said there with, start small and grow. And I think that, as planning is so important, like having a strategic plan is very important for your organization. And so even if you are, from meager beginnings, as most organizations are, there's always a plan in place to, hopefully, to grow. And so I think sometimes too, when you have a new organization, a new idea, a pressing need, you want to go for the moon and the stars, and pacing yourself could, potentially be helpful. Okay, if we have a 3-year plan, well, this is what we can accomplish in year 1 with these resources. And then in year 2, this is how we can scale, and kind of match your resources up with, your plan as you continue to grow. And I will say too, sometimes funders will ask that question, like, okay, if you could dream big, if tell us how much that, that would cost. And okay, well, out of that, what are your main priorities? Because that also helps them determine, right? They know they have limited budgets as well. So they, that helps them determine priorities as well, and to see how best the funds that they have available can be most useful for your organization.
In part, yes. depending on who you're applying to. So we talked about this in the workshop that funders will often say, here's a percentage that can go toward salaries. And that's why we encouraged you to think about doing that time study for a couple of weeks. Where's my time going? So yes, but this is where understanding the RFP is really important. Know the grant guidelines. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yes, it depending on, like you said, what type of grant. If it's like an operational grant that can help support your budget or your salary. Jumping back though, really quick, there are also funds available for like capacity building. So you could ask for a capacity building grant or like a planning grant. Even at the community foundation, there's the nonprofit technical assistance fund that will give you a certain amount of money to hire a grant writer or to do certain things. So I'm sorry, I jumped back just a little bit.
That's okay. I was going to say the same thing. The other thing is when you're putting together the organizational budget or the program budget, you put in the salaries of the people that are going to facilitate those programs and the percentage of the time, and then you figure out a dollar amount for it. So that also, if you're one of the people that are going to be help teaching the program or facilitating the program, you can put that in the budget, and you should.
Well, I think you have to tell your story, and you have to have someone that specializes in this. Of the people doing the work aren't really good at describing what they're doing because they're busy doing it. You need someone who's focused on telling their stories and gathering their information and gathering information on outcomes with whatever language they're speaking. Also, I find that, keeping everything the shorter the better. Like concise is good, but the less you write, the less opportunities for confusion and mistakes. And then the grant should be the end of the process. It's sort of a contract between the charity and the foundation of what we think we can do with this amount of money. So there's a lot of conversation going on before that, so that whatever documents created in whatever language it is, there's an understanding if a word is misspelled, that's okay. When I was reviewing grant requests for the Queens Council of the Arts in the Borough of Queens in New York City, there was an arts organization from Honduras or Nicaragua where handwriting in pencil was more formal than using a typewriter. So understanding some of these cultural ways of communicating is important in the context. And maybe the organization can educate the funders about that.
So we're getting ready to teach a homeownership class in Swahili. So I would say you need to connect with translators in the city or organizations or associations that do that. The Hispanic Chamber, once again, the Grand Rapids Chamber. Yes, I'm in leadership Grand Rapids this year, so. But they have a lot of resources for their members, and so if they don't know, they can connect you to a resource. So I would say look at translators, look at your Hispanic Chamber, and look at the Grand Rapids Chamber to help you find those resources so the materials can be translated into Spanish or whatever language there are, because I'm sure there are networks that offer those services.
Hispanic Center translation in like 140 languages. So.
The Grand Rapids Community Foundation has the Somos Comunidad Fund, and that sounds like a great thing for them to champion. So I just think that, tapping into, making it known that that's a need, right, to funders, and those that have the resources that could maybe bring the resources, but also just the awareness that this is a need within philanthropy that needs to be fulfilled.
And I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier, being bold. Like if we see these issues in community, then we need to be raising them to the funders. We need to be raising them to leadership, like the foundation, the chamber, et cetera, et cetera. I believe the Hispanic Center here in Grand Rapids has a translation service that does something like 140 languages. I don't know what the cost. I know there's a cost, but I think it's very affordable from what I have seen and understand. So, but if nobody in the community actually knows, and granted, I realize that sounds weird and this probably gets a little bit into the next question, but if nobody in the community knows that this is a need, nobody's taking care of it. So we have to be bold and step up and ask the questions and say, here is a need that we have in our community. And I think the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, because they're pressing more into this work, would be a good place to start. I will say, from a research perspective, and this is not a good thing, but it is the reality of the sector. From a research perspective, if you look at grant making across the country, Black and brown led organizations or predominantly serving organizations receive a fraction, a very small fraction of the funding as white-led or white-serving organizations do. That is the reality of the sector. I'm not saying it's a good reality, but we all have the ability to change that by communicating the things that are happening, by holding, quote unquote, those in power accountable, bringing these things up, putting the conversations on the table. And the sector is much more willing to have those conversations than they were even 5 years ago. It's shifting. Is the movement fast? Like it takes time, but there is movement. And this is where collaboration can sometimes be really helpful. Because if you have a Spanish-led, Latin-led organization or Latin-serving organization that's not getting traction, find a white-led organization to partner with and build those relationships and leverage their network. And this is where those of us who are, privileged to be in the dominant culture have to learn to let go of and share that power.
And I think Tatum mentioned it already, but the Community Foundation is really taking a concerted effort on grant making for minority BIPOC organizations right now. And they have a Black Legacy Fund, and they have given many dollars, over $600,000 to BIPOC-led organizations last year. So I would get connected with the Grand Rapids Community Foundation because that is an initiative that they are really serious about.
Yeah, I think the answer to this issue is not becoming or turning into a white-led organization or becoming a white seeming organization. It's to stay authentic to your roots and to your message and your mission. People with money are very conservative. That's how they stay, that's how they get rich. They're very cautious. The change doesn't happen quickly. Tamala mentioned they need your organizations more than you need them. And to stay true to that work and force them to support you. Keep asking, keep telling your story, keep getting turned down, keep doing the good work. And the tools and habits and work will come along. Someone will gain the experience necessary to jump through the ludicrous hoops that are created. Maybe they can help other organizations in your coalition. You got to play the game a little bit, but you also have to stay true to your character.
There's been a lot of investment in the Hispanic Center. And so, you know, even just having a general awareness about what maybe some of these larger institutions that might represent your community, what resources they have, and see how you can partner with them, you know, potentially to leverage their resources too.
So I mentioned the book of lists because it'll list all the foundations, but a tool that, and I'm currently looking for a grant writer, a tool that my last grant writer used is called Instrumental, and you spell it instrument, and you don't have the A, and it's an L at the end. But it's pretty, it's a tool, it's a resource, there's a fee, but it's relatively inexpensive. You can get the first option for about $179 a month, but it'll help you with researching grants, managing grants, and it's a pretty inexpensive tool, but at least it's a way that you can start using an option if you don't already have something. Foundation search is another one, but it's fairly expensive, so larger organizations typically use that. But what I liked about Instrumental, it was affordable, and it did bring us some new leads.
I would say too, outside of grants, like, you know, a lot of, I mean, obviously corporations have foundations and, you know, corporate giving, but a lot of smaller companies have smaller giving funds, or they might have, you know, an affinity group, you know, like a BIPOC affinity group within their company, marketing dollars and or just other discretionary funds that they are able to invest in organizations. And not a lot of organizations, I think, on a large scale tap into that because it takes more relationship building, right, to find out what companies have what. But once you get in there, you're in there. Like some of these companies, once you know, connect with an employee in that company and maybe learn about their structure and find out, you know, opportunities to partner, you never know how that relationship can flourish and how they'd be willing to partner and or support a specific initiative without even having to write a grant. So
I know for some of you, we said Instrumental is affordable, and some of you are going, yeah, no, close to $200 a month isn't affordable for me. I get that, right? This is where collaboration matters. Find 5 organizations that all have the same need and say, can we partner together, and each pitch in? Somebody's going to have to own it, but you can drop a partnership agreement. Reach out and call the different universities. Many universities, not all, many universities will allow you a guest card to use their library. Find out what they have. Stephen mentioned earlier, the Grand Rapids Public Library has a whole area for grant research, and you can reach out and learn that. The other thing I would encourage you to do is think about, how do we build capacity and where do we gain resources? Interns are amazing. Look at every college in our community and find out who offers a grant writing class. You know Aquinas does, because Stephen I used to teach the one at Grand Valley, and you know what my students were required to do every semester? Write a real live grant for a real organization. They learned how to do the research. They had to identify 3 potential funders, went through the whole process for a nonprofit. So look for resources in your community that can help grow your capacity as you're growing up, as you're learning, as you're developing. And students are amazing. Like, get grad students. I will say some of the best grant writers I've ever found were MSW students. because they have to learn that skill as part of their program. So don't underestimate the value of those connections.
I'm 501c3, so I don't know.
Okay. Okay, but here's the thing. Foundations only give to C3s. And there's laws governing that. If I remember correctly, a C4 is political. Are you looking it up, Stephen? And a C6, I don't remember which is which. One is a political and one is a membership, and I don't remember because I don't play in that space much. I think 4 is political and 6 is membership. Are you a 6 or? Okay. C6 is membership. Here is the challenge. This is why many, many years ago, the Grand Rapids JCs started a foundation that is a C3, because foundations can't give to 4s and 6s. So there's legalities that there's a whole lot of IRS regulations about being a foundation. So that's why PACs will sometimes have another funding arm. The JCs started the foundation years ago because we didn't have a way to receive gifts from foundations. So you have to understand the legalities of what you're doing. Under the IRS code 501c, there's 29 different types of organizations. C3 is the traditional charitable organization, which is the majority of them in the country. And that is the C3 is the one that foundations can give to by law. So you have to pay attention to that.
I'll answer. I guess the term of what you would do is if you're an individual or a different type of organization, you'd get a fiduciary to receive the grant, and then they would transfer the funds to you, so that the fiduciary is the one responsible. And then there's the issue of,
They can't legally
transfer it.
funds to you. They can pay bills.
Okay, pay bills.
And your program cost out of that. Correct, but they
Yeah.
can't. It's not like they can accept the money and transfer it to your organization. They take the money and legally. Sorry, I'm just going through a whole contract with a fiduciary. I'm just doing a whole contract with a fiduciary for one of my clients. So the fiduciary takes the money in, and then they can pay your bills. You have to go through all their process. You have to have a legal contract naming them as fiduciary, stating what can and cannot be done, what are the boundaries of the project. So I just wanted to correct the language because I wanted to be careful. They can't transfer money to your organization. So yes, fiduciary, fiscal sponsorship is what we call it. Growing trend. Tons of great organizations across the country are fiscally sponsored. There are organizations that's all they do is provide fiscal sponsorship for a fee. They take a fee. There's an admin fee. But, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to be thoughtful about language. Did you want to?
No, the fee is the issue too.
Yeah. Because that's a real dicey legal issue, and you have to be very careful. Has it yet?
It's about to.
Well, Grammarly is AI.
Yeah.
So right there, the ability to take your document and have it revised, suggestions to make it more formal, less formal, more business-like, less business-like. Also, the AI ChatGPT is really good for the needs statement. Give me all of the resources around poverty in Grand Rapids in 2022 and cite sources. Of course, you have to check everything because it gets a little confused, but it's a good way to pull together a broad range of information in a very quick manner that gets you started. one issue as a grant writer is keeping things fresh. Like, how do you write what you're writing about year after year after year and not bore the reader? How do you stay up to date on the latest research trends? And ChatGPT is sort of set up for that.
I think outside of grant writing too, because I know we've talked about just operating on a limited budget. AI could be useful in other areas. So you need to create a social media calendar for your organization. Chat GPT could be a great resource to pull that together for you. Or you need to write a press release about something. I mean, definitely always check it and make sure that it also, speaks to the voice of you, of your organization. So you'll want to cater it to your organization's message. But it could be a useful tool if you have limited resources.
And that would be my 2 cents worth. Use it as a tool and a starting point. AI is never going to write in your organization's voice, and that's important, right? AI is never going to be perfect. Even I love Grammarly. I have it built into my software on my computer so that it checks everything as I'm writing. And that I guess I don't think about that as AI. I always think, the more advanced stuff that we're dealing with today. But it's always a starting point. There are things Grammarly doesn't catch. There are things your word spell check doesn't catch, right? There's things that it won't catch. So use it as a tool and a starting point, not as the end-all, be-all. That's my caution.
Yeah. My boss asks me all the time, did you use ChatGPT to write this? I said, no, because I refuse to use it. So, so I wouldn't use it as a starting point. Use yourself as the starting point. So we just had a big gala, our biggest fundraiser of the year. And so I always do the awards segment. And I was like, okay, how can I say this differently? So I wrote it in my voice, and then I put it into GPT chat. And so then it still used my general thought and some of the things that I wrote, but then it tweaked it in other areas. So that was my first foray into really using it for something. So I would say use yourself as a starting point first and use that AI to enhance what you've already created.
One final comment is AI is based on analyzing, synthesizing billions and billions of documents that are online, which means they are created by people of privilege, people of wealth who had enough money to pay for internet and pay for computers, and their voices come through, and you have to be really careful because the racism that is baked into the whole process of white people talking to each other and then using these tools to talk about other people is very problematic.
Don't worry about impressing the grantor. Worry about being honest and true and authentic and writing an evaluation plan that you can actually manage. Don't say, I'm going to do this big evaluation and I don't actually have any evaluation skills in my organization. Or time. And keep in mind, this is the best thing anybody ever taught me when I was doing my master's program, because evaluation scared the heck out of me. I was like, I don't know how to do this. It's terrifying. We evaluate things every minute of every day. We're constantly evaluating the world around us. So when you think about evaluation, it's not, do I hire a professional evaluator? There are times when that's necessary. There are times when that's the right thing to do. Most of the time, it's not necessary, especially for those of you in this room, because we're smaller organizations. So write an evaluation plan that says, I know how to collect data. I know how to understand what that data is telling me, and I know how to keep that data safe. Password protect your computers, lock up physical forms, right? Basics. So how do I collect data? How do I keep it safe? And how do I make sense out of it? Don't feel like you have to have this big, huge, gigantic evaluation program when you have a small community-based program. Keep it simple is my 2 cents worth. Now, if you're doing a multi-million-dollar grant, they're going to want a sophisticated evaluation program. It's trust. Remember, it's risk mitigation. That's what a funder's looking at. But they're still going to be looking at how are you collecting data, how are you keeping it safe, and how are you making sense out of it?
I think too, definitely the quantitative, everybody wants that, but we should also value the qualitative data. What are the differences? The qualitative is like the stories, right? The relationships that, you develop with your participants, clients, and that is very valuable as well. And that data also helps to be able to tell your story. I know one funder and several funders actually have asked, how do you make sure that the people that you serve, that their voice is involved in your decision making? And that's really qualitative evaluation. And so even just thinking about if it's a focus group or, a end of year conversation or whatever it may be. I just think sometimes qualitative data is overlooked, and at times it's a little bit more palatable than the quantitative. It's more absolutely. It is more compelling. Like you can shoot them numbers all day, but they're going to ask for the numbers and the stories. So have both.
Based on the numbers.
Yeah. The only thing that I would add is the grantor is always going to ask you about challenges. Be honest about that. Be honest if something didn't work out or it didn't reap the result that you said it would, and the reasons why. That's not going to get your grant dismissed or the money taken away from you, because a lot of times we did a big project that was something new, and all the things that we thought were going to happen didn't happen, but the grantor is still supporting because the majority of the things happen, and we might have had to change some things or tweak some things along the way. So don't be afraid to talk about what didn't work, because they need to know that. And especially if it on a whole is doing well, they'll want to replicate that or share that in other markets. So you have to be honest about the results and the outcomes.
If you're not having any failures, you're not challenging yourself enough. You're just playing it safe, and then what is anyone ever learning or making a difference?
Drop the mic with that one.